everyone, and welcome to Making the Rounds again. It's at this point the longest standing series of content I think I have, so that's what I'm going with. But we are once again doing international coverage of the mid-season invitational while my computer tries to go to the moon as usual. But we are going to be covering what happened in the early group stage, less so than in the Rumble stage, just because I think no one really cares about major region teams destroying minor region teams unless they're talking about how funny it is that Cloud9 lost to Detonation Focus Me. However, we will be talking about the Rumble stage and the semifinals, but first we'll start with a piece of controversy, I guess, that's been very popular on the Korean forums lately, discussing the schedule of the semifinals, which historically, apparently, the first seed team at the MSI Group stage always played first, and then the second match would be the third, or the second and third place teams playing against each other. So, from that perspective, Emily, you've read a little bit more about this. Can you give me more context as to why this would be something that would be unsettling for the fans of Damwon Kia?
Yeah, so basically, what happened was the semifinals schedule came out, and Damwon Kia is playing Mad Lion second, which is a deviation from every other schedule historically for the Mid-Season Invitational, given where the first seed ends up. So basically, Ashley Kong reached out to Riot Global, and they said that it was because of due to COVID testing timelines and traveling logistics, which is a bit of a non-answer, I'd say, but also when you do consider the lengthy quarantines that you do have to go through to get back into Taiwan, for example, it is like, and the fact that I don't know when the PCS starts, but I know China also has a pretty strict quarantine, and it LPL starts sooner than everyone. But putting that aside, it actually doesn't matter if you're expecting like RNG to go to the finals, right? Which I think most people are. So for me, I think it's a controversy because it's such a deviation from every other schedule. So it doesn't make sense to swap it up now. Now, I think the other question you have to ask is, what do I personally think it's a huge deal with how condensed the schedule is? And I think you then have to consider what you would rather have. Would you rather have the ability to watch the first semifinal and know who your opponent is before you even play in your semifinal and kind of have that, be able to take the momentum from your win into finals? Or would you rather have a day to reset and prepare while the other team plays their semifinal? So for me personally, I would prefer going into the second semifinal, but that's not really the point here. I just wanted to say that this is kind of negligible when you look at it, but the fact that it's a very obvious deviation that kind of makes no sense as to why they're doing it, or at least not with the reason that was given. And then additionally, the fact that it seems that, Damwon themselves would have probably preferred to play first. And, if they are the first seed, then in my opinion, they should get that choice, regardless of whether it would be my choice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, it's a little bit funny because I know one of the things that people are talking about is that consistently the first seed team has played the first series, and most often, they've won the MSI. It's funny to me because usually the first seed out of groups is just expected to be the best team anyway, right? So that's a little bit of a weird statistic to refer to, especially since there have been instances where the first seed team has lost, right? They've lost the first round. Like very first, yeah, I mean, very obviously you kind of go back to the 2016 MSI, I guess. That was RNG SKT, where SKT had the Heidi Lau problem. If you remember. Where they did terrible the first day. RNG came out first, right? And then RNG lost, but SKT still, right, was in the first semifinal.
Mm-hmm.
So those types of situations are just interesting to refer to, because it's like most often, yeah, the first seed team is gonna win the MSI. So conflating those two is a little bit misleading. For me, I think it's pretty interesting because you talked about momentum, but other than just momentum, I think sometimes it just helps with prep to see how the other scrims are going before you go into your semifinal match, to see kind of what's being successful or not, to learn from how teams are adapting to more extended phases. It was interesting to me that this came up, because I obviously don't pay attention to details like this, but as a competitor, someone who has competed before, right, the North American Academy and the other extended formats, frequently when there will be the finals held the week after the semifinals, so you have a full extra week to prepare, they'll usually consider it an advantage to the team that's seeded higher for them to play the second semifinal match, because in that case, they have an extra day to see the other two teams, and then they still have the full week to prep before the grand final. So it's just interesting that those two things in those separate situations could be seen as advantages or disadvantages. But to me, it's just very interesting, because I think, legitimately speaking, it doesn't matter that much, because you're probably not going to have an extra scrim day anyway, right? Most likely, whoever loses the first semifinal is just going to go home, and then plus you have the other two teams playing, so it's not like you're getting an extra scrim day out of it to prepare. If you were getting an extra scrim day, then you can probably raise a concern there, but it's just going to be a reset day, or a mental reset day. And obviously a lot of players are pretty fatigued after playing one best of 5 and then going into another one, but I think it's less meaningful than having an extra day of scrims or something like that to kind of test what you learned from the semifinals and go into the finals.
Yeah, I think what I come around to at the end of it is, if you are first seed, you should get the choice of when you want to play. And so if Damwon want to play first, then they should have been given that that choice.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense to me. I think that's a good solution. However, I do understand that the context behind the COVID makes it sort of impractical. I also understand the fact that Mad Lions is going to play on a Saturday. I think you were talking to me about that beforehand, in Europe, during primetime Europe, on a Saturday instead of a Friday, so that's probably better for viewership. But until Mad Lions lose, or if Mad Lions lose, I don't know, we'll talk about that. I think but before that, however, this is a nice transition to go into talking about the group stage themselves.
Woo!
So going all the way back to the beginning, was there anything particularly surprising to you about how groups or Rumble stage played out?
I think the biggest surprise to me, because every group pretty much ended up, even if it took a different route to get there, I think every group pretty much ended up the way that we expected. Outside of Group A, and obviously you and I had already talked about, if GAM Esports were here, I mean, I know I personally would have put them to get second out of this group. I maintain that, having seen Pentanet and UOL. I do think that Pentanet getting out was a big surprise for me, because I did not expect that. And then the only other thing that really surprised me was how comparatively well Detonation Focus Me played, given my own personal expectations of them. And maybe that's because I didn't watch them enough in the LJL, but I thought they were going to be a lot more, I guess, like, they were almost like downright disrespectful in some of their games when I watched them in LJL, because they were so much better than most of the teams, that they kind of didn't respect vision, or they would overextend and stuff like that. And I thought, compared to my expectations, they played really, really well. My opinion on Ebi has not changed. I still think he is the best Japanese player that the region has ever produced. I think it was cool that we got to look at how he plays the lane, and that Dead FM decided to play around him. But yeah, like the only like truly surprising thing for me was that Pentanet managed to make it out of Group A.
it's surprising, but then you consider that this is probably the only time a team has gotten out of a group with a 25% win rate.
This is true.
And then at that point, it's kind of like, yeah, I guess that'll happen sometimes, right? Because they basically only had to beat UOL a couple times. They ended up winning 3 games against them, right? Because the tiebreaker counts as a third. Or yeah, there were way too many games in that group. Let's just put it that way. That was the one day I streamed that was the full like second round games, because it was a Sunday and I couldn't stream it and it was just RNG playing, and I was just like, there's too many games in this goddamn group. What is the point of this? I forget.
Yeah.
There was a format alternative that someone suggested. I forgot what it was. It was along the lines of they play like less games, but then they put RNG UOL at the end, and then they put all of the tiebreakers on the same day, right? So if you have a tiebreaker, then you end up just playing on RNG Royal Pentanet Day, and RNG Royal Pentanet play less round robins. So I thought that was not bad as an idea, and then you just finish the day earlier. It also feels weird because then they're playing way less games than the other teams, but they're also playing way more games now in this format.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the best solution is. But it was definitely not the group that you'd want to see so many games of, I would say. I don't think it was the most entertaining group. There were some, I think RNG went out of their way to make some games entertaining. One of my favorite moments was definitely when, I think it was Cryan and Wei hit the blast cone into 5 people, and they had full vision of the area, and they knew it was going to be a 2v5, and they just did it anyway. I was like, yeah, this is good.
I think it was
this is great.
Their first, let me just double check. Their first match on the like big day. Yeah, their first match against UOL, where they all decided to, even though they knew they were there, they decided, yes, we are definitely going to funnel into this choke point in Topside River against a Rumble and a Victor. We are going to think that is a very good decision. And they still ended up winning that game anyway. So,
Yeah, so I would say for me, the Japanese performance was probably a little bit more surprising overall, just because just in terms of considering the fact that I had it in my head that at the Worlds play-in for 2018, DFM beat Cloud9, but they didn't. It was just a really, really close game, right? So, because I went back, because I remember watching that game and seeing Svenskeren do a really weird invade. I had this specifically in my memory because I think I even made a video on it. So I was like, oh, but didn't they do it? And then I realized it wasn't actually C9. It was EDG lost to Infinite. They were Infinite at the time, I think. Infinity Esports. That plan was super weird in general, but that tournament is also considered largely an anomaly, right? The 2018 Worlds. So,
yeah, it was a very weird,
it was just
a very weird time.
It was just funny seeing G2, and considering how poorly G2 and C9 performed in that play-in, I think everyone, and even EDG, right? I think everyone was surprised to see how well they ended up doing, and that's where a lot of the narratives about the third seed being advantageous and playing through the play-in being advantageous became super popular, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway,
especially after G2, I think.
They had like a 5-game series, or were they 4? I think they were 5-game series against the CIS representative was Gambit, right? I can't.
They had.
I'm too old. I can't remember this stuff.
They went. C9 went 3-2 against Gambit, and then G2 went 3-1 against Infinity.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, I remembered one of them had a 5-game series. So that's a fun one.
Well, they made semifinals, both of those teams. But yeah.
Yeah. But I digress. I don't want to talk too much about the group stage, other than to say, I guess, like, how did you feel about the format in general? Did you feel that it was kind of unnecessary? Would you prefer it going back to almost a wild card play-in type stage, or did you think that this was kind of better for I guess you being kind of someone who's always been really invested in CBLOL and some other wild card regions, do you think that this was advantageous for some of those teams to play this kind of group stage?
Yeah, it absolutely was. So then the question is, like, do you think that these are, like, competitive enough to warrant this kind of thing? And honestly, I think the answer is kind of yes. Like, I wrote about this in 10 Thoughts because while I'm not going to be, like, a huge fan of this format, I do think it was kind of skewed because of how many Group A games we had to watch in terms of people's perception of how bad it was, right? Because very obviously RNG significantly outclassed both UOL and Pentanet, right? Like, there's just no way to get around that. And that group was very one-sided. And I know a lot of people were just like, okay, I'm not even going to bother watching these games when RNG is involved because it's just not going to be competitive. But I think if GAM had been here as well, then we would have seen fewer complaints about that. And since it is a single game format and Riot loves their single game formats, and they're going to come find me after this and kick me out of the broadcast for saying that I hate single game formats, but they typically end up being a lot more volatile. And so when you do have a team like Detonation Focus Me that I think at the very least prepared for how they wanted to face a team like Damwon or how they wanted to face C9, and how they did end up playing around Evi, I think that you end up with some really interesting single games because of the single game format more than anything else, which is the thing that we already know that Riot's not going to change, right? So that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I like the format for wildcard teams because, I mean, you look at any interview from pretty much any player on any of these teams, and they're like, was super valuable for us to have to face a lot of these teams and to have to face a lot of these laners because we don't get this experience where we're from, and we do feel like we learned a lot. So I will always like soft side on their side in that regard, and I also do think that a lot of people's perception of how bad the format was skewed by the fact that Group A was so uncompetitive. And I also think that, again, single game format, and as long as that doesn't change, it's always going to be kind of volatile or have the appearance of being kind of volatile.
And as much as people complained about, from a viewership angle, about this format, absolutely more people watched the English language broadcast of this than they would have of the play-in. Like 100 of a normal play-in. 100%. It's way more worthwhile from a Riot perspective to put on multiple language broadcasts of this kind of format than to do a segregated play. And so I think even if you don't have good viewer enjoyment, I guess shut up and don't watch, because as it is, what you're doing is you're complaining and drawing more attention to a format that you don't like. So hooray. But I think this type of tournament, like, obviously it always sort of ends the way that you would expect, right? With RNG coming out on top. I think there were a lot of PSG Mad Lions dissenters leading into this, but I think it just ended up being Mad Lions on top, Damwon Kia. Like, if you hadn't watched any League of Legends all year this season and you look at these results, the only one that would be weird would be the Pentanet over UOL.
Yep.
Pretty much. And maybe Pain over Istanbul, but that was like one win off. So yeah. Anyway, so that's enough for the group stage. In terms of the Rumble stage, I think obviously the first thing we have to address is Cloud9 losing again. I don't know why at this point, we have to even talk about it. But here we are again. North American team has not made it to the to the playoff stage of the midseason invitational. Basically, the NA team has only made the playoff stage of the midseason invitational twice, right?
Yeah, CLG and TL, right?
Yep. So that comes down to, and I forget, because right, G2 vacation was the circumstance, right? Because that was the G2-8, and then
that was a rough year for G2. Both at MSI and Worlds. Yeah, that was a rough time.
But the G2-8, and then of course 2019. Yeah. So I think the question then becomes is like, why are people still surprised, I guess, by this? What has changed to make them expect more? What do you think?
Yeah, it's weird because the midseason invitational is very specifically only one team. I think that one thing you have to consider is that typically the winner, again, and I've talked about this with Worlds and tried to reiterate this over and over again, the winner is going to be whatever team is typically best in the current meta. And so whatever team makes it out might not even be the quote unquote best team from that region. I know a lot of people were having that discussion when RNG qualified. And I'm not going to get into that discussion. My point is more that if you end up qualifying out of whatever region, be it PCS or NA, which was kind of the question in terms of who was going to make it out as that fourth spot, right? Which didn't end up being the question by mid-Rumble stage. It was who's going to drop out. Mad Lions or Cloud9, I think, is kind of what it turned into, given how PSG performed. But yeah, historically, the best representative that makes it to this stage from the PCS or from the LMS previously has always done pretty well in this format where you're sending all of like the best meta teams at the time, typically. And that's something that people should, I think, always consider. And then additionally, yeah, the expectations for this C9 team, I think, were very high because of a few reasons. And the primary one actually being that because we didn't have a midseason invitational last year, and because that particular C9 team just kind of raised through spring split, I think everyone was kind of equivocating those two teams and then building it up as this kind of year-long narrative of, despite the fact that they made some very visible roster changes, this is the team and they're gonna come and they're gonna enact revenge and all this stuff. And I don't even think Cloud9 performed super badly compared to my expectations, my personal expectations for how they would play. Like if I look at the way they actually play on the Rift, they made some interesting decisions that I didn't expect to come out of this team. But yeah, I mean, I think it's I think something that should be discussed is expectation setting, especially in a tournament like this, where this tournament is just significantly more brutal than a world championship because there's only one team from each region.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting thing to bring out. Is, do you feel like, let's go all the way back to last year, if there had been an MSI, it would be JDG, T1, right? Was it T1? I can't. My brain is so dead.
Let me double check. It would have been JDG, G2 Esports, T1, Cloud9, Talon, Team Flash, Kaboom, UOL, Dead FM, All Knights, Legacy, and 1907 Fenerbahce.
Right. So if that tournament had happened, do we feel like Cloud9 would have done better than this year?
I'm trying to think of who was on this Talon team. It was the Hanabi River Candy / Tank Unified Kaiwing. So kind of the same roster minus Maple. Maybe? I'm not sure, actually. Again, because it's still just a really unforgiving format. And then we also would have had the Team Flash roster, which would have been interesting to see as well. So I'm not even sure how I would have felt about JDG, to be honest, because I didn't even expect them to win this spring final. But anyway.
Yep.
I think they would have performed.
Actually, I think you did say JDG would win the spring final, but you thought TES.
Didn't I?
But you thought, because
Yeah,
I remember
crap.
you were like the only one.
Yeah, I did say JDG would win. It was the summer.
But it was in a way. But you said it in a way that was like, but TES will be better, you know, kind of eventually.
Yeah. Wow, I actually got something right, and then I just didn't remember. That's always fun.
But I guess for me, my question is if we are kind of cashing in on that C9 hype, because I thought instead, rather than that being the narrative, because I'm pretty sure that people sort of at this point retcon that roster a bit just based on their summer performances, with Miski in particular.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought more it was cashing in on this idea that Perks's international legacy is so impressive in his recent years of his career, right? More so than the beginnings, the G28 era. But I think I felt like that was more like this idea of, because every time I hear people talk about C9, it's the idea that he is the best Western player of all time. Yeah? Mm-hmm. It comes up over and over again. I guess this is another thing we can talk about, is if we feel like, because a lot of people are very critical of Perks' overall game impact at this tournament. Did you feel like Perks kind of underperformed what you expected of him, or where is your opinion on that?
I mean, I think the thing with Perks is kind of something that you brought up going into this event when we were talking about C9 in our first video, which is like, how much game sense did he bring to Cloud9 from like can you see what you'd consider his fingerprints on G2? Can you see those on C9? And I don't really think you can all that much. And I think that some of the things, this is outside of Perks individually, but I'm just talking about game impact and like how the team plays. I think because people perceive C9 to have lost in a variety of ways with a variety of different drafts, that they kept making really different but obvious mistakes. But I also think that there are some pretty big gameplay through lines that C9 had that are indicative of the fact that they play in North America. Pretty specifically, kind of an over focus on Drake stacking and kind of an inability to juggle it or like leverage it well, or as well as a team like Mad or RNG or Damwon Kia. And I think that you could see that in a lot of their losses, as well as kind of like a through line that was a gameplay thing that I don't feel like I saw from G2 necessarily. So it's really difficult to discuss his game impact on an individual level. I don't feel like he performed as well as he could have, or like as well as I guess people expected him to. But I wouldn't like pin their losses on Perks either, you know? Like I think there were a lot of reasons why C9 lost. But in terms of like, I guess I never expected Perks to come to North America and just be this kind of person who was automatically gonna come into the mid lane and then shit stomp people all the time. That was kind of never my expectation for him. I always thought he was going to be a good player, and I am one of those people who think he's probably the best Western player we've seen, which is a discussion for another time. But I'm just putting my perspective of Perks as a player out there. But yeah, in terms of like individual performance, I think because Blabber also kind of had a rough individual performance at times, those two mid jungle are so intrinsically tied that it was obviously going to bleed into the rest of the map as well. That's a kind of a convoluted answer, but in terms of like underperforming, I guess he did compared to my expectations a little bit, but not in a way that I look at this and I'm like, they would have won if Perks hadn't underperformed, you know?
Yeah, there's a lot there for sure. I think the most interesting thing to talk about, one of the more interesting things to talk about here is when I think of peak mid lane Perks, I think of 2018, probably that series against RNG. That was a tournament in general where I felt Perks actually outperformed Caps. So I remember in the wake of that 2018 World Championship, I was very confused by the roster decision, but I would say that when he played mid lane on G2 after that, I would say he was not as good at mid as Caps was, and Caps was not as good at AD as Perks was. And even when you're talking about Perks' AD performances, I don't think they hit that 2018 Worlds performance, especially not the most recent ones. So for me, when I think about the footprint, that was the thing that was more interesting to me, like the impact of the team that he could have. Because obviously I do think Perks is a very skilled individual performer, but for me, that hasn't been the thing that's been underwhelming to me as much as this constant idea that eventually we're going to get an import that's going to teach us to play the game, because it never happens, guys. It doesn't. So many of them...
Give it up. It's not happening.
So many of them come here and they get frustrated because when they're trying to play side, their team just all dies mid, you know? It's surreal. No, but I think I don't think that's kind of the end all be all problem, right? That's an oversimplification of the issues that exist within the North American ecosystem. It's less so about, you know, oh, they all just die mid. It's more about the fact that when you're playing within a meta, right, your understanding in the way that you visualize the game before begins to subtly change. You're also not as inspired by the ecosystem that you were in, right, because you no longer have access to that ecosystem. So your ideas begin to change and kind of conform with the ideas that exist within the other ecosystem. I think on the last episode, I brought up an example of, you know, if you're trying to make a play on the map, assuming that the enemy team will perform the way that they would when you were playing on your last team, and then they don't because they all went to Dragon on an uncontestable Dragon, and then your team dies because they're playing 4v5, right? Then you have to change the way you're playing, right? You have to adapt to what the enemy team is doing, and then you go to the international stage, and then they're doing the opposite. They're going top to get ahead of the tempo and letting you have the uncontestable Dragon. So it's a really interesting problem, first of all, and I think that expecting someone like Perks, because G2's biggest advantage was their mid game, in my opinion, to have that kind of impact on Cloud9 by himself. And I think even at this point, a lot of G2 players have come out and said, you know, without Perks, we do feel lost. I believe I saw a couple of interviews to that effect when they didn't make the mid-season invitational. So I think at times, right, they said they felt lost. They didn't say it universally, but excuse me. I do think that's one of the things that you're kind of wondering, like if there's someone who could do it, maybe it's Perks, right? There's someone who can have that footprint. But I think at this point we need to kind of stop expecting imported talent to change the way we're playing and the way that we're learning the game. So that's a really interesting problem, because I think it's not even something that one individual team can fix, right? But so that's where I'm more. I already knew that C9 wasn't going to play their mid game that well. I thought their mid games were like one of the top 2 most atrocious from the quote unquote like non pool 4, pool 3 regions. So I thought that was kind of my biggest concern there. But so to me, that wasn't that surprising. I think when you're talking about the Blabber underperformance, a lot of the stuff that got blamed on Blabber, I think, is just failure to plan as a team. And maybe that's Blabber making a bad call, but that's more what it was. It was like failure to plan or prepare as a team. I forget what matchup it was, where it was like Fudge didn't have Prio, and they came at the end and they said, oh, we didn't realize we didn't have Prio. It's like, you should have Prio in that matchup, right? It's not a misunderstanding of the matchup, it's a misplaying of the matchup, which could stem from a misunderstanding, but it came off, I think, in reflection as if they had the wrong idea about who gets Prio, which was very strange. But it's just like those types of things being blamed on one person, I think, again, is when I look at that, it's like a lot of early game planning of NA teams tends to be poor, right? There isn't clear plans like we're making X play on this wave based on these circumstances. It's more, it feels really fragmented sometimes. So I guess that's a really, really long answer to I didn't feel like there was a really big underperformance by any single player that caused C9 to lose.
We are in agreement then.
Cool. All right. Nice. Very easy to fix to get along, I suppose. What do you think about that? What do you think about the narrative that the way in which C9 lost was perceived to be weird or strange?
I mean, I'm not really sure what way people are talking about in that regard. I will say this, and I'll repeat something I said in the random perks like wandering tangent I had. And it's that I think a lot of hallmarks of problems that North American teams have, especially I pointed out the dragon stacking thing and just the way they play, the way their jungler communicates with lanes. And this is something that I pointed out, I think, in another Making the Rounds episode when we were allowed to do one at last year's Worlds, didn't I? I remember talking to you about it. I don't know if the episode was ever released. Putting that aside, I think that one problem that North America typically has when you compare them to other teams, even teams that might struggle in the mid game or make some really bad decisions in terms of like cross map trading, is that they still at least have or seem to have a good understanding of when their lanes need to help their jungler and when their jungler sometimes needs to help their lanes. And I think this was something that C9 was visibly behind in terms of the top teams that did make it to knockout stage. And then additionally, the dragon stacking thing and how they treat dragons as an objective as a whole is not leveraged in the best way possible, in my opinion. And I think those, if you look at from game to game to game to game, I think in a lot of these games, you can kind of point out one very specific breaking point that the game like broke open for the opponent. However, I don't necessarily think that that is mutually exclusive with problems that are through line in all of their games.
Yeah, I always like to use the Game of Thrones clips for when we're talking about NA teams at Worlds. Anyway, the
dragon clip.
With the Daenerys. Where are all my dragons?
Oh my god.
But yeah, I think that's like, for me, a lot of the weirdness does come from. It's actually interesting because when you talk about a lot of the veteran junglers who have played in NA for a long time, so not just the NA junglers, but a lot of the veteran junglers who have played for a while, very few of them are actually the ones responsible for the early game plan, which to me is really strange because when you're thinking about how to structure the early game, right, the jungler typically has the most agency. So it's interesting to me that that's not traditionally how it has been structured historically in NA. So compared to other regions where I've talked more to those teams or seen them around. So Yeah, that's one kind of tidbit. I think that that's increasingly different. I don't know how C9 works specifically, but that's one thing that I think makes it a little bit trickier to kind of, or a little less surprising that the synergy between the laners and the understanding of like how those lanes were flowing, because I do think probably a lot of it just was, our conceptions of how to play these lanes ended up putting us in situations where the plans we set up couldn't be executed. I think that that's fair, and that's something that you continuously see in North American games, is that a lot of times they are playing the lanes wrong. So, yeah, I guess that's basically all I have to say on that. So I think for me it wasn't too shocking. In terms of what people were saying that were weird mistakes C9 lost off of, it would be like a scuttle contest, or they were pointing out the RNG backdoor, which to me, that's just how RNG wins a lot of their games anyway.
Yeah.
So none of those things
I even
were
pointed
too
that
weird,
out on broadcast.
Yeah.
I even brought that up with like a whole segment.
Yeah, I mean the RNG, and we'll talk more about RNG in a second, because I think probably we don't want to beat the dead C9 horse too much. That's probably just going to be the title of the episode.
The dead C9 horse. Oh my god.
The dead C9
now,
horse.
if you don't title it, I'll be disappointed.
But but I guess from the RNG perspective, again, it's like the simplification of how you play the game at this point through that lens. It's like Cloud9 is almost the extreme of that. In a lot of ways, Damwon Kia is kind of like the extreme of that, except better, which is just focusing on dragon stacking, focusing on like these types of mid-game fights without very clear defined early game plans. So I think that's one way to, it's like they're, in a lot of ways it felt to me like C9 was like a worse Damwon Kia. Unfortunately. So there you go. Fun times. Speaking of Damwon Kia, who we've talked about directly or indirectly, this sets us up well, even though they're the second semifinals. We'll just treat them like the first semifinals, We'll treat them the way Korean fans want them to be treated, and talk about them first. Do you feel, were you surprised by their performance here, or did they perform about as well as about to what you thought? Because I saw a lot of people saying, maybe Damwon's even worse than Lions. Maybe Damwon's even worse than PSG. Like, a lot of people were very critical of Damwon, despite the fact that Damwon only lost to RNG in the Rumble stage.
I'm wondering where these takes are coming from. But I think
Travis Hot Tub streams. I should be very transparent on that one. Is that I watched a lot of Travis Hot Tub streams. But go ahead.
Okay. I was gonna say, I was like, wait, where on earth are these takes coming from? Because I like never visit Reddit now that I'm on broadcast, because I just like, my mental is already really fragile. Anyway, so it's not actually, but I don't need to expose myself to that. Damwon performed about as I expected. I think that we talked about how they don't have a very well-defined early game, and how, in my opinion, that was the way that you could attack them and beat them. If you could still make really good mid-game decisions, you could attack them early. And that is where I think they are weakest as a team typically. And then I think that was proven by their play. I don't think I saw much from them that really, really shocked me whatsoever. I think that if anything, maybe the Mad Lions games were some of the most interesting to me in terms of their single games, just because of how they managed to shut Mad down and how kind of hesitant Mad seemed when they played against them as compared to other teams. I think they banned both. I think they banned the exact same things actually on red and blue side, but now I am checking that just to make sure I'm not talking out of my ass. Thresh, Varus, Lucian, Leona, Oriana. So they banned Gnar in the first game, and they banned Leona in the second game, but everything else was the same. And I think a lot of that was to make sure that Humanoid wasn't on his like two most comfortable champions where he automatically gets mid lane prio and then they could just rely on Showmaker to have mid lane prio. And both times it was the Victor Zoe matchup. So I think the way that they thought about Mad Lions and kind of attacked them um and staved off a lot of early things that Mad would have wanted to do early against a team like Damwon Kia was pretty smart. And then in other series where they struggled in their early game, it wasn't super unexpected for me because I think that was kind of what we identified as their weakest point. And even when they were coming back, like when they were winning some of these like shakier games in the best of threes and like the LCK regular season, it was because they would end up turning on their opponent when they made a mistake, or they would end up, cross mapping or 5v5ing better when it came to mid to late game. It wasn't this like bombastic, super early game focused, super aggressive, proactive team. They kind of went towards the SKT style of things, which again, I brought this up in our first video, but a lot of people have been kind of attributing to Coma. And then the difference is that Khan has been a lot better about teleport flanks and the way he's come into team fights. So, yeah, I mean, I wasn't super shocked by anything I saw from Damwon. I'm not sure if you were. They played the way I expected them to play.
Yeah, I almost feel bad recording this episode because I feel like after watching group stage and rumble stage, I have the same exact opinions as I had before.
So I was like thinking that's why I like kind of wanted to bring up the Mad Lions game because I was like that was kind of the most stifling I saw them early, but yeah. My opinion on them is exactly the same as what it was when we recorded our first video.
For me, the thing that still makes them a bad matchup for RNG, right, is that their abject refusal to draft champions that win side lanes in mid game. They just, I don't know. It's like we really need to blind Sion here. It's necessary, and you know that's how RNG win. But you make no effort to kind of alter that game plan, right? Which is a very, it's a confident thing to do is knowing the way you play your game and not changing it. But at the same time, it's just, I think it's just really hard to deal with RNG when they do win side lanes. So I think I think the solution is almost easy as long as your top laner has a champion pool. So for me, that's kind of the puzzling thing there. I guess you can start questioning whether or not Khan has a champion pool in the sense that he will play certain champions very strangely in lane. But that's a conversation for another day. I think I guess for me, I still feel like RNG have the strongest mid game of any team in the tournament, just in terms of their understanding of the map. But Damwon probably have the strongest ability to team fight, right? So that's where it's an interesting situation where it's like when everyone else in the world opts into those situations for you, you're obviously going to win, so that's I think where we see Damwon getting their advantages. And for me, Mad Lions do some interesting mid game things, right? They do some things where they're willing to leave like certain turrets up so that it's easier for them to rotate to dragons, or they do a lot of those things, but they're super greedy with their tempo, so it almost never matters, and they end up face checking anyway. A lot of times they'll just end up all showing on the mid wave and hitting the turret there and not setting up their Baron in any way that will allow them to close out the game efficiently. So I have a lot of issues with, basically, if your early game sucks, you'll lose to Damwon. Is kind of how I feel about it. And, or not early game, mid game.
If your mid game sucks.
If your mid game sucks, you'll lose to Damwon. And Mad Lions mid game sucks. Pretty much every team at this tournament has a bad mid game in my opinion, except for RNG and Damwon. So there you go. That's the way it is, guys. Um, I guess in terms of Mad Lions, do you have anything else to add or anything interesting about them that you didn't, any opinions that you had of them that you did before? I think Humanoid is one of the, I still think Humanoid is like the best or second best mid at this tournament, so, but that's
I think I would put him 2 behind Showmaker. I think the way that Mad play around Humanoid's priority is really smart. But I already thought that coming in. Again, they haven't really done anything that's changed my opinion on what their strengths and weaknesses are. I think the only question I really had for them before seeing any games was how well Elyoya was going to play with the new jungle meta. It seemed like something that suited him more, and he himself said that since he wants to interact with lanes a little bit more, that he was happy that there were champions that he could do that with. I'm not going to get into the whole Rumble jungle discussion here either, but I do think that this has been he's seemed like completely comfortable coming into the current meta, and that was kind of one of the only like really big questions I had. It was how they were going to adjust and whether that would kind of trip them up, and I don't think it did. I think they've shown again the same strengths and the same weaknesses very consistently throughout this tournament that we also saw from them in the LAC. Very boring answer.
I think teams with good Rumble jungle players made it to playoffs. That's what I'm going to say. Yeah. Okay. But it is interesting because definitely there were teams throughout the tournament that dropped Cryo and Rumble, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say RNG was even one of them. And I think a lot of RNG dropping their prio was that they're more comfortable playing pickups. But yeah, it's interesting. Whereas like Rumble has really good early skirmishing, but I wouldn't really associate him with a pickups. So
yeah,
Morgana works out a little bit better there. But the also, yeah, I guess for me, like, is there any, like, do you feel like it's a controversial to say that Damwon will win? What do you think that there's a world where Mad Lions win? Do you think that?
I think there's a world where Mad Lions win, but they really have to. It's like it's one of those things where I'm picking Damwon. I've said that they're gonna win 3-1. If anyone's curious to like the exact prediction I had to make, or am going to make on broadcast.
Spoilers.
But I think the big thing for me is that even if Mad get an early lead, the problem is that they then still don't have as good of an understanding of how to trade for things in the mid game as you need to beat Damwon. Because if they give up prio or vision or whatever around like Baron or really crucial Drake, or don't set up their side lanes correctly, Damwon are just going to kind of like swoop in, fight them 5v5, probably kill them, and then take whatever the objective in question is. And I think they're really good at punishing Mad when they're trying to make a lot of these mid game things, as we saw from both of their games. So I guess if Mad were to win, I think they need to be significantly more proactive early, and then find some way to carry that into the mid game. I also think the other problem with this matchup in particular is that the way that Damwon play around Showmaker and the way that they've already shown that they want to get Humanoid at least off of his 2 heaviest priority picks, they feel like they can deal with the Victor really easily, is a problem for Mad if they don't find a solution around it, because obviously Damwon are just going to presumably keep targeting Humanoid in draft like that and making sure that he doesn't have easy prio on these comfort picks that he very obviously loves and that Mad can play around really well. So that's another reason why I think it's a really tough matchup for Mad.
Yeah, I think even if Matt get a really significant early game gold lead, they're still going to pick a poor front line and then try to face check into neutrals and all die. So that's pretty much where I am with Mad Lions. So transition, by the way, Mad Lions or PSG? Which team is indeed better? Just since we're not going to get to see that matchup, most likely. I mean, maybe we will in the grand final. But
that would be a very entertaining grand final.
A very interesting grand final for sure. I feel like that's been just because I follow Raz and Forest Within, I feel like that's the predominant, most interesting narrative at MSI for me is Mad versus PSG.
Nobody, let it be shown that nobody beats PSG 4 times in a row.
Just because I remember Forest, basically what happened was he rated Mad Lions like below Pentanet, I think, in his power rankings. It was very interesting, and everyone was flaming him for it. And then obviously Mad Lions, they beat PSG on the first day of group stage, right? And then people come back to him and they're sending him like flame on his tweets, etc. And then he ends up deciding to post an edit to his power rankings that puts PSG even lower in the standings than he had them before, saying, on reflection, I've decided to reassess my ratings of Mad Lions and put them lower. So just stuff like that is entertaining to me. Just because like the rest of the tournament, I have felt, despite the fact that there has been a lot of back and forth, there's been a lot of North American fans reacting violently, etc. If on English-speaking Twitter, for me, that has been like the funniest kind of storyline.
I didn't even realize this is going on. The PSG mad.
The PSG mad rivalry. It's almost entirely perpetuated by Raz and Forest within the North American Kindred one trick streamer, who bets on LPL all the time. But but anyway,
I think on LPL, man, that's rough.
He got almost 100% in his playoffs predictions.
Whoa, damn. He schooled me.
He popped off for that, but then in the end, FPX let him down. Anyway, the main thing that I'm curious about, does it matter if Mad or PSG are better? And 2, of course it does, because we're doing a talk show about League of Legends, so what is your opinion?
I think the most impressive thing I've seen from PSG is, and again, I guess you kind of had to expect that this was going to happen, but I didn't know how much it was going to happen in terms of the fact that the team has obviously grown in comfort with each other in, basically slotting in Doggo to this lineup. I think PSG, more than any other team, seem to always load into the game with champions that they feel comfortable on, regardless of whether I like their draft or not. I always appreciate when teams really stick to what they feel that they will be comfortable on, especially at international events. Again, even if I like pan their draft in terms of what they're going up against in their opponents. And then the other thing is that I do think PSG are really willing to attack their opponents early. I think River has been playing pretty well. I think Kai Wing has been playing well. And are they a better team than Mad Lions? It comes down to the mid game, and both of these teams, in my opinion, have highly questionable mid games. PSG is very obviously uncomfortable closing out a game against a team that can actually punish them for some of the map moves they make. I don't think, when I came in to talking in our first video about PSG, my thing was that they're so used to being so far ahead that how are they going to react to falling behind, or how are they going to react to teams kind of outpacing them or out trading them in the mid game? And I think the answer is still not great. So it's a very similar problem to some of the things I've seen from Mad, although I think they execute their mistakes in different ways. And then who would win in a best of five? I think Mad would win in a best of five. So I'll give the edge to Mad, but it's pretty close. I appreciate how PSG have kind of ramped up throughout this tournament.
It's funny to me because I feel like these teams are really similar in a lot of ways. The predominant one being that they coin flip their bot lane really, really hard a lot of the time, just by doing really troll things that don't even necessarily make sense or work in the matchup, right? And they either snowball their bot lane really, really hard, or they pretty much lose the game. I feel like that's sort of true of both teams, just because both of them have questionable mid games. One thing that I think is beneficial to PSG is that I think they set up like low range flank comps really well, right? By getting like deeper vision, being able to collapse and get picks that way. But I would say overall, like if they can't put themselves in that position to skirmish or to get those types of advantages, they don't execute well. And their comps tend to be difficult to play like front to back. So if they can't set up the map well enough to get those advantages, then it's a lot harder for them to play as well. I think the thing that gives Mad slight advantages is just I actually do think that their overall bot lane 2v2 prowess seems to be a little bit better. Even though that's a controversial statement. I feel like it's weird because almost all of the bot lanes in this tournament are not great. There are definitely some good supports at this event, but in terms of like laning 2v2s, I would say, like Beryl and Ghost have been trolling. There are games where Gala and Ming are trolling. There are games where Karzi and Kaiser, and then you think of all of these supports, and they're all great supports, right? But like Kai Wing is a great support, but it's sometimes they just, they have those games where they are picking engages, they're trading like Aftershock for zero reason, and they're just dying, It's a fun one. But I think that it's just funny because this is not a tournament necessarily about laning bot, unless you're really focused on 2v2s or really focused on like front to back later on in the game. Like you don't really get the payoff until later. But it is a tournament where it's easy to set up dives, right? Like Rumble is a champion, for example, that really, really facilitates setting up dives. So with bot lane, very advantageous to set those up. So for me, I guess like I can see why this is an interesting back and forth or why there's controversy around the statement, but I do give the slight edge to Mad Lions just because I think that they have slightly more ability to get the setups that they want for their compositions and the way that they're thinking about drafting, even though they're really, really greedy about tempo. So that's where I am. That's my
I think my thing for PSG's drafting, even though I said I do actually really appreciate them for this, is the fact that they will over-index on things that they're going to be comfortable with, right? Even if it's not the best matchup or you feel like it might not even fit with what they want to do with their composition. I think we've had a few moments of that, especially when some of Maple's champion pool has been banned out. So I want to bring that up as well in terms of when we look at PSG, because I think that's actually, it's a good thing that they keep their team comfortable in draft, but I also think it's something that can be exploited if you're willing to play champions that go up against that really well.
It's funny because I think that they are the worst team in top 4, but I also think that they're potentially the best team to play against Royal of the 4. I think that they're actually the team of the 4 that's most likely to beat RNG in a best of 5. As weird as that is to say. So we'll talk about that series now with this transition. What are your initial thoughts on the RNG PSG matchup?
I actually agree. I think that PSG are almost kind of the perfect team to beat RNG, given the way that they like to play for picks and the way that they really are focused on kind of not necessarily smashing you early, but I still think that they are a laning focused team. Um, and I think that is a carryover of how they played in the PCS. And I think it is one of their strengths. And I think we saw that in when they handed RNG their first loss at this tournament, right? I also think that the way that they kind of wanted to separate skirmishes out and were kind of relying on RNG to take these fights before they were ready, or for when it was very actually disadvantageous of them to take them. I know that when I tweeted that RNG had that like really good game against Mad where they were like cross map trading really well and they're focusing on side lanes, I like tweeted this is exactly how RNG like to play. And then after the RNG PSG Talon match, you're like, you need to say this again, and I just retweeted it because this is also how RNG like to play. Sometimes they pick really bad fights, and their 5v5 isn't always the best. And this composition that PSG picked was really good about like repositioning the fight, so it was a lot better for PSG, right? With the Lee Sin, the Morgana, Maple, Zoe, and then Nautilus and Tristana. So I think that this was a really good draft against RNG, and also the way that they executed on it early was really smart. And I think if a team is going to beat RNG, they basically need to make sure that they can't set up inside lanes like they want, and they have to come contest objectives when they don't want to, and they have to take these fights when maybe they'll go in for the fight because they feel like they can win, but they can't because their opponent can reposition, or their opponent just has a gold advantage at that point, or they have a stronger team fighting composition. And I think PSG actually understand that pretty well in terms of how they can force RNG to not play the way they want to. I'm still giving the edge to RNG here, mainly because of the issues that I already cited about PSG Talon's mid game. However, I think that if PSG Talon beat RNG in a best of 5, I won't be completely shocked. I'll be a bit surprised because I think that between these two teams, RNG should be able to adjust a bit more over a best of 5 series. I picked RNG to win this 3-2, I think, if I remember my predictions correctly. So I'm expecting it to be kind of back and forth and messy anyway. But yeah, that's kind of my read on like why PSG Talon looks so dangerous for RNG.
Yeah, RNG also over-index really, really heavily on controlling topside jungles, opponent and their own. And I think that PSG is one of the only teams that actually cares about, contesting that very extensively, other than doing full clears or things of that nature. I think they've had some of the more interesting approaches, again, because they do care a lot about mid-game and mid-game, or early game and early game snowballs. They've had some of the more interesting approaches to their jungle matchup. So I guess from that perspective, I think that that's something we can really see. I also feel like, even though people will say Hanabi isn't as strong as Xiaohu, which I think is even potentially debatable just because of the situations in which Xiaohu's pool is like a little bit limited, I think it's just going to be, sometimes RNG, they got to blind Gnar, and I think PSG are really happy with those situations, right? So a lot of it, I think, can be, basically from the beginning of time, you've been able to tell whether or not RNG will win their games based on their draft. If they'll have a winning mid-game side lane with Xiaohu, they can win the game, If they don't, then they probably lose. So I do think a lot of this will come down to draft it. So I can easily see this being like a 5-game series, or even a 3-0 one way or the other, So I do have RNG again. I don't necessarily know if I agree that RNG are more flexible over the course of a draft. I think if it really came down to it, actually their champion pools are probably more limited, especially around mid. But we'll see. I think probably I still like slightly favor RNG just because I do think RNG have the best mid game in the tournament, and I think that if they ended up against Mad or Damwon, they probably win the whole thing pretty easily. So yeah, that's that gives you my finals prediction there as well. Just because I think it's funny because I do agree that Damwon Kia are the second best team at the tournament, but I also think they're the ones who are the least likely to beat RNG, just because of how little they seem to care about drafting a way that punishes RNG. So yeah, that's my take there. So I'd be curious to hear yours, because I remember at the start of this I was calling RNG to win MSI and you were calling Damwon.
Damwon, yeah.
Yeah.
And I am still tentatively giving it to Damwon. If only because I think the way that sorry, I'm going back and looking at these drafts just to remind myself. I think the way that they are playing around Showmaker specifically and his mid lane pressure can, again, like, I feel like a team that beats RNG has to be able to destabilize them somehow in a way that they don't end up with the side lanes that they want, that they don't end up with Xiaohu just split pushing the entire time. And I think that split pushing gives Damwon Kia hives, and they don't deal with it well. But I also think that the way that Damwon are playing around Showmaker right now is not a bad response if they can force RNG to basically, again, fight them at some sort of disadvantage. I've gone back and forth a lot about this, actually, because I think that RNG's like mid-game map trading is better because of the way that they play around side lanes as opposed to Damwon. So I think it's also going to be heavily draft dependent. But I'm still giving. Now I'm convincing myself out of it. Still, I think I'll still give the edge to Damwon just because when I look at their single games, I think that RNG's first game against Damwon was really indicative of what I expect from these teams, but the second game was a lot closer, with Damwon being able to force some of these fights that RNG will sometimes find themselves like not being able to help but take. And I think that really stands out in my mind, that if Damwon have a good draft that focuses around the mid-jungle duo that they have, that can exploit Cryin and kind of shove the map in, which I think they, again, like, have the power to do, I think they can beat RNG in a best of 5. But I won't be shocked. I think it's going to be RNG and Damwon in finals. I won't be shocked if either team wins. But yeah, I'll stick with my Damwon prediction.
I think it's interesting that your pronunciation is of RNG is slowly becoming Irish.
Damn it!
It's like half.
Dagda, this is your fault.
It's like half half R.
It's because I kept tweeting at him all those orangey things. Like every RNG win, I would tweet a picture of oranges at him. Mm-hmm. Ugh. You ruined me. Now I'm mad.
It's funny because I don't even know how to replicate it, but it's like half O, half R sound. It's funny.
My accent's so bizarre because I've lived so many different places and I got made fun of as a kid.
Yeah, I've been told sometimes that I have an accent and I don't know why, but yeah, it's an interesting adventure. I think, yeah, it's interesting to me because I think that they do play for Showmaker, but it's in a way that's not like very mid-game skirmish focused, mid-lane skirmish focused in the early game. It's way more like Showmaker gets freedom to go to side lanes, and then Showmaker gets really, really ahead and carries team fights. It's kind of how I see it. So they're not directly, in my opinion, the way that they've been setting up the games, abusing mid. And that was like one of the factors that contributed to me making the RNG prediction initially. But it's just for me, I don't think you beat RNG by blinding Sion. I just don't think you can. So unless they specifically change that approach, then RNG just kind of get whatever they want. Plus, they may win the mid-jungle 2v2s, right, if they take them, but they will not win the mid-jungle 3v3s because I think Beryl is actually just drinking like a 40 before he goes to the studio every day. It's very interesting. I don't know what this guy is doing, but it's he's like constantly late on his rotations. He's actually just like not even realizing he's taking the wrong runes allegedly. I don't know what's going on with this poor kid. I feel like of everyone who's probably Beryl is like to me the guy who's underperformed the most this entire event. So it's kind of unlucky.
See, I actually think that he has performed pretty similar to how he performed in LCK. And I think it's just a matter of what Damwon do around his deaths, if that makes sense. Like, they basically make it so that his deaths don't matter because they'll try to trade something for it. But you could see, my point in all this is that you could actually see some of this in LCK as well.
There were some games where like for example, I thought his Braum was one of the most tragic Braums I've ever seen. But there were definitely some games where I was like, what is going on? But it wasn't this bad. Like, I feel like at this tournament, it's almost every game. Whereas before, when I would watch demo games, right, when I was doing my VOD review, it was like sometimes Beryl is trolling, but not as much as I feel like he is here. So I get what you're saying in terms of like you could see that this could be a liability because, I mean, a lot of people were super critical of Damwon's bot lane. But I'm actually kind of mind blown sometimes when I watch him play. It's like I'm saying this and I'm emphasizing it this much because I don't want to say he's just bad, you know? But he's not been doing great. And I'm a big advocate of support diffs, so there you go. I think that's also a big thing for me. That's keeping them that's making them struggle a bit. Is because RNG also have the capacity to draft specifically to win 3v3s around mid, because they don't rely that much on 2v2s, and they're able to counter FPX's ability to do it. So that's another reason why I have trouble giving it to Damwon. But yeah, like I actually think they're more likely to lose to PSG in semifinals than they are to lose the tournament. All right. Well, to lose in the finals to Damwon, I should say, because that doesn't make any sense. What I just said. But they're more likely to lose in semifinals.
I was like, wait. It's one of those things where your brain just fills in the blanks.
Like,
yeah,
like, I know.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then I was like, wait, what?
I know what you're trying to say, Kelsey, but all right. Before we go, I have one more question. Because I think that there's been almost every single team except for Damwon, right? Because Damwon is just so decisively the best team in LCK. A lot of people, and by every single team, I also PSG, right? Because PSG were very decisively the best team.
Yeah.
But every team except for PSG and Damwon, pretty much there's at least a handful of people saying, it should have been TL, or it should have been G2, or it should have been FPX. If you could pick one team to send instead of their actual representative to MSI, who would it be and why?
I feel like a bunch of people will be screaming at me for not picking FPX. Because I feel like that was, the team that most people, including myself, expected to be here. But I'm actually pretty happy with the way that RNG do play around side lanes. Oh my god, now I'm just going to be super self-conscious every time I say Royal never gives ups gamer tag. I'm really happy with how they play around side lanes in the current meta, so I think that this is something that really suits them. So I am happy that they're here, even if I think that there are other teams in LPL that could have had a really interesting representative. I think that it would be, and this is not just because C9 lost, but it's because there's unfortunately always this weird what if for me over this recent LCS finals because of Santorin's health issues. I actually talked to him today for something else completely unrelated, but we were talking about it, and he had like really, really awful migraines to the point where like he could not look at a computer screen, right? So I think that really sucks. And I would have wanted to see the best of 5 between both of these teams with all of their starters that had practiced, together for the most part. And that's not blaming our Mayo either, because I don't like pin the finals loss on his fault. Like, I'm not like, oh my gosh, he was obviously so terrible and blah blah blah. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Their Mayo would have done just as poorly.
I think that I would be really curious, I guess, to see this TL team. Primarily because despite the fact that I was very critical of them over the course of the split, and despite the fact that I think Fudge performed really, really well at this event, actually, I think it was a great event for him in terms of like him being able to level up a lot of his individual play. I would have been really curious to see TL here with Alfari, with the way that Santorin and Jensen were kind of trying to develop their synergy, and with the way that they would try to play around topside pressure. I don't know if they would have done like better than C9. I think they probably would have ended up kind of in the same spot, to be quite honest. But I would have been curious to see how they could have evolved at this tournament, given their strengths and weaknesses over the course of the entire split, especially around trying to transfer some of Alfari's topside advantages to the rest of the map, if that makes sense. And then I guess the other one that I would be super curious about would be obviously G2, because I think despite mistakes that I saw them make in the LEC, I think they can be really good at playing around side lane pressure. And I think that is a pretty good way to play League of Legends, just generally, but then also right now in the current meta.
I mean, when I was doing my VOD review, quite honestly, the one that was the most frustrating thing for me to get through was Rogue versus Mad final. Because I made the mistake of watching the first game of G2 versus Mad, and despite the fact that, they had Karma Leona bot lane, I definitely preferred watching that game, because I thought, there were so many times where I was watching Rogue Mad where I was just like, wow, Rogue are just bad. Not even like, and obviously there deserves to be context here, because I'm not saying Rogue are the worst team in the world or anything like that, but it was just compared to a lot of the decision making that they had around the map was just not on the same level. So for me, it was just, I would have liked to see G2, and I do think, the reason why I say that is because I do think that they're a team that kind of understands the game in a similar way to RG, and so that's a matchup that I think would be interesting. Obviously, I'm not going to come back and say that they would necessarily do super well, because or better than Mad Lions. But I do think that that's a matchup that I think is pretty cool. So yeah, I guess for me that's the one that I would go to, and that's just because for me Mad G2 felt more like the final, even with some of the really weird unplayable comps that were being drafted from G2. I just, not to say, like, Karma Leona is it's not just that Karma and Leona isn't a real bot lane, it's just that it didn't work within the context of the rest of their drafts either, right? Like, it just didn't do anything.
It was a decision.
It was a decision that was made. But
so, it was a decision that I did not personally agree with.
But even like, but you have to go back on that and then say, okay, if they're drafting that, then there's obviously something going on with their understanding of the game and how it should be played, that they've decided that this is a good thing. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a better team, and if they had like a real champion that they would win or something like that. But I even like when it was obvious that they were fucking trolling in a lot of ways, they would make trade decisions, or they would do X, Y, and Z, where it just felt like Rogue were kind of almost impaling themselves on some of their own map movements. So yeah, I guess for me that was the one that was the biggest disappointment for me, was just G2.
Yeah, the reason why I pulled G2 out instead of Rogue is honestly just because of the way they play around side lane pressure. Mm-hmm. I think it's a good way to play.
Yeah. I mean, the game for me has gotten... The reason why I am such a big RNG fan and probably come off as super biased is because the game for me has gotten so boring to watch in so many ways. Like, oh, I guess we're gonna go dragon. Oh, I guess we're gonna 5v5 around this stupid dragon. Oh, I guess we're both coming to mid at the same time. I don't know, I just get really tired of watching that over and over again. So when you do get teams that are playing it a bit differently, that aren't focusing on dragon stacking, they're really much more enjoyable for me personally to watch. I get for a lot of League of Legends fans, it is super fun to watch the fights. Like, I'm not... The 5v5s, like, those are always kind of satisfying for everyone, because you do see some great moments, but I feel like you have those great moments in RNG games as well, like the really insane outplays. Like, I think was it the PSG game? I can't remember what game it was where RNG had just such a clean fight with the Lilia.
Yeah, it was the PSG game. I think their second game against PSG. Let me double check. Again, all the drafts.
Yeah, like, the second one was the one that they won. But yeah. I think it was that game where it was just surprising to me, because RNG usually kind of troll their team fights. So, but at the same time, you do get those moments. You can have teams that can do both things. Mm-hmm. It's rare, because if your team can play fights well, then you don't have to go through the trouble of avoiding them. But like RNG frequently do. So that's, I guess, for me, why I find them really interesting, because I do constantly say I think dragons are a little bit overrated in terms of the early game priority that a lot of teams have on them, and you can put yourself in situations where even if you're 2 dragons down, you're guaranteeing that you're getting there first on the third one. It's just more difficult to execute sometimes, because there is like the pressure factor that's involved. So I guess for me, that's why I probably come off as super RNG biased in a lot of ways, but that's also why I like G2. It's one of the reasons why I've been drawn to G2 for a really long time as well, in terms of just enjoying watching them play their games. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
I think my favorite thing about RNG is that sometimes they'll just lose a 5v5 that they take and like they shouldn't have, and then you'll notice immediately after that they're just like, fuck that shit, not fighting again. Like, we're just gonna completely focus on side lanes and not try to fight you again. And I think that's really cool. I think it's cool how in some of these games, not all of them, but some of them, they're really quick to understand whether they can fight, and then they put all of their focus into making sure that they're dragging their opponent across the map enough that they don't have to.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Exciting. So this has been making the rounds. Very fun. Sorry that this episode was kind of us in a lot of times stating the same shit that we said last time.
Yeah, but you can just replay the first video.
The first episode.
I mean, I think that's kind of interesting in a way, right? Where like all of these teams came in and they performed pretty much how we expected them to perform.
Yeah, usually the last episode we're saying, oh, this is why we were wrong.
Yeah, this is true.
So, either we grabbed
2019 Worlds, every single one of our videos was like, so we were really wrong about that.
Yeah, so maybe I just made my last point. The game has gotten really boring. There we go. Yeah, now we're gonna get the PSG Mad Final, and we're gonna have to do the post-mortem on why we're wrong. Okay.
Let's go.
I'm down. I'm really
willing it into existence. That'll be a fun video to do.
For sure. All right. Everyone enjoy the last 3 days of MSI.
Woo!